Hey everybody, welcome back to another instrument training video. Today we're going to get our first exposure to low altitude approaches. But first, let's look at those administrative details. Make sure you have done those very important reading assignments, that you have enough time to watch and absorb the lesson. Be sure to find the handouts that are associated with this portion of training and use the pause button when needed. Today we're going to look at procedural tracks specifically, but we're also going to look at the whole concept of low altitude approaches, the parts of a low altitude approach, and then we'll get into some procedural track specifics. Here are your objectives today, with our goal being to understand how to set up for and properly enter then execute the published procedural track in a T6. Let's get started on the lesson. Low altitude approaches are used to transition aircraft from the low altitude environment to final approach for landing. Low altitude instrument approaches exist for one purpose: to assist you in guiding your aircraft to the final approach fix on course, on altitude, and in the final approach configuration. It has become normal to expect ATC to provide radar vectors to final. However, you must always be prepared to execute the full approach when appropriate. There are two broad categories of low altitude approaches. In this module, we're going to look at procedure tracks. There is no specific depiction for a procedure track. The plan view of the approach shows that it may employ radials, arcs, courses, turns, or even teardrops. Procedural track symbology is used to depict the flight path. The depiction used is a heavy black line showing intended aircraft ground track. The legend of the instrument approach procedure can help you decipher the symbols. To help you remember that you must fly the depicted bold line, think of the procedural tracks as railroad tracks. The railroad cars can only go where the tracks are. And so it is with procedural tracks. You can only go where the tracks are. Also, be aware there may be depictions of more than one procedural track or another type of low altitude approach on the same plan view. Most procedural tracks begin at an initial approach fix, or IAF. IAFs can be a nav aid, radial and DME, or a GPS waypoint. Sometimes the IAF and the final approach fix are the same point. ATC will normally clear you to the appropriate initial approach fix and then clear you for the approach. Unless ATC specifically clears you otherwise, you are expected to fly to the IAF and execute the full instrument approach procedure as published. Flying the approach is now putting into practice those basic aircraft control maneuvers you learned about early on in this instruments course. In a T6, low altitude approaches are flown at 150 knots, so your vertical S maneuvers take on a real purpose when flying procedural tracks. Prior to reaching the initial approach fix, you should have slowed down to 150 knots. I like the technique of looking for 10 miles from the initial approach fix to start slowing from my en route airspeed. Entry into a procedure track approach is really quite easy. When over the initial approach fix, turn immediately in the shorter direction to intercept the published track. If your heading is within 90 degrees of the procedure track course, you may use normal lead points to intercept the course. If your heading is not within 90 degrees of the course, overfly the fix and turn in the shorter direction to intercept the procedure track course. The HSI on the right indicates that the outbound course is within 90 degrees of the aircraft's current heading. When a descent is depicted at the IAF, start your descent when a beam or past the initial approach fix and on a parallel or intercept heading to the procedure track course. Then conform to the specific ground track shown on the instrument approach procedure. A descent can be depicted at any point along the procedure track. Arc to radial and radial to arc altitude restrictions apply only while established on that segment of the approach. Once a lead point is reached and a turn to the next segment is begun, you may consider yourself established on the next segment and then descend to the next applicable altitude. Just a note that this is another definition of the term established to add to what we learned in previous lessons. Additionally, lead points can be published, as in this example, or you may have to compute one of your own using 60-to-1 math. A couple of notes about procedure tracks depicted as a teardrop. Where a teardrop turn is depicted, you may turn to the inbound course at any time unless otherwise restricted by the approach plate. However, do not exceed the published remain within distance. If flying a teardrop, do not descend from the procedure turn altitude until you are established on the inbound segment of the procedure track. RNAV procedure track approaches have what are called terminal arrival areas, or TAAs. For more information, I suggest you review IN2-17 Volume 1 and various online FAA resources that discuss TAAs. At the initial approach fix and at every fix along the procedural track, there seems to be a lot to do. Our job is to do it in an efficient and timely manner. To help yourself get through what needs to be done, I recommend using the 6 T's. They are a great aid to help you aviate, navigate, and communicate. In fact, as a technique, when 6 miles from the initial approach fix, review the actions of the 6 T's for the particular approach so that you can execute them at the initial approach fix. The best way for you to prepare to fly procedural tracks is thorough mission planning and chair flying. You'll know the direction from which you'll be arriving at the airport, so chair fly starting with an en route descent point in order to arrive at your selected initial approach fix 10 miles early. Then plan the approach using the 6 T's and 60-to-1 math to ensure you can comply with any altitude restrictions. Once inbound to the final approach fix, the procedure track simply becomes flying and instrument approach final. Well, that's all I have for the teaching portion of this video. We'll see you next time.